Hey guys, tonight we begin with the cold, muddy, and quietly catastrophic world of the Napoleonic Wars. Not the generals. The men. The ones walking in boots that stopped fitting on day 3, eating something that was technically bread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe pull up a blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 to 1815, 12 years. Fought across a geography stretching from Portugal to Moscow, from Egypt to Scandinavia, involving somewhere between 3 and 5 million military deaths, depending on which historian's methodology you accept, plus another 3 to 4 million civilian dead from war-related causes, plus a typhus epidemic in 1812 that killed more soldiers than any battle in the entire conflict. In those 12 years, approximately 3 million men served in the French army alone, not counting allied and conscripted forces from the nations Napoleon controlled, which added another several 100,000. The generals who directed these armies are remembered. The men who were directed are not. Tonight is for the men who are not remembered. You are 22 years old. This is the most common age for a Napoleonic conscript, though the range ran from 16 to 40, depending on the year and the desperation of the recruitment. You are from a village in eastern France, or Saxony, or Poland, or the Netherlands, or any of the dozen nations that supplied soldiers to Napoleon's campaigns or to the armies that opposed him. You are not especially tall. The average height of a French conscript in this period was approximately 5 feet 4 inches, which is not the height of the romantic military heroism of the paintings. You are not especially well fed. You grew up in a rural household where the diet was adequate in good years and inadequate in bad ones, and your body carries the record of which years were which in ways that a regimental physician would notice if anyone asked a regimental physician to look. No one will ask. The regimental physician has other concerns. You have been given a uniform. The word given is doing some work in that sentence. In theory, the French military supply system was organized to provide each soldier with a complete uniform kit. The blue coat with its white lapels, the white breeches, the black gaiters, the bicorn or shako hat, the cartridge box, the bayonet, the musket. In practice, the supply system was one of the more optimistic fictions of the Napoleonic military administration. What you actually received was probably a coat that fit well enough, breeches that fit someone else, gaiters that were issued in a size that did not correspond to any known size of human leg, and a musket that had been used before and showed it. The cartridge box was real. The bayonet was real. The hat was real. In the formal sense that these were objects that existed and were in your possession, you were fully equipped. In the functional sense that the equipment would serve the purpose for which it was designed, under the conditions you were about to encounter. The situation was more complicated. The musket requires some attention because it is the central tool of your profession, and also the most informative single object in your kit for understanding what the next several years are going to be like. The standard French infantry musket of the Napoleonic period was the Charleville model, a flintlock weapon with an effective range of approximately 50 to 75 meters against a man-sized target, though this assumed conditions that rarely existed in actual combat, a dry day. A flint that had not been worn smooth by previous firings, powder that had not absorbed moisture, and a soldier who was not moving, exhausted, smoke, blinded, and surrounded by the noise and confusion of a battle. Under actual field conditions, the effective range was considerably shorter, and the hit probability at any range was considerably lower. You knew this because everyone knew this. The musket was not a precision weapon. It was a device for projecting lead in the general direction of the enemy in sufficient quantity that some fraction of it would arrive at a target. This is why Napoleonic infantry fought in close formations, shoulder to shoulder, mass fire, rather than aimed fire, because the mathematics of the weapon required mass to be effective, which sounds like a reasonable technical solution until you realize what it meant in practice. You were going to stand very close to people who were shooting at you and try to shoot back before they shot you first, at a distance close enough that you could see their faces and they could see yours, in an environment of smoke and noise so intense that you would not be able to hear commands, would not be able to see more than a few meters in any direction, and would have approximately 3 firing attempts per minute if you were skilled, and considerably fewer if you were not. Translation: A Napoleonic battle was a contest conducted at close range, in near blindness, at a rate of fire that gave each side several opportunities, per minute, to kill people standing a short walk away. This is the activity you have been conscripted to perform. You had approximately 6 weeks of training before being assigned to a regiment. Some of the skills involved in the previous description take longer than 6 weeks to develop. The training itself deserves a moment. 6 weeks, in the period immediately preceding your assignment to a regiment, in which you were drilled in 3 things: marching in formation, loading and firing the musket, and following commands. Not tactics, not battle strategy, not the considerations that would allow you to make independent decisions if your officers became casualties, which was one of the things that happened regularly in Napoleonic battles. You were trained to march, fire, and obey. These were the 3 competencies required of an infantry soldier, and they were the 3 things that the training system was designed to produce. The assumption behind the training was that the decisions would be made elsewhere, by people who had time and position and information to make them, and you would execute the decisions. This assumption turned out to be partially correct in some campaigns, and almost entirely incorrect in others, and the difference between the 2 cases correlated rather closely with how many officers had been killed in the preceding engagement. But you are not at a battle yet, you are on a road. This is where most of the Napoleonic Wars actually happened, not at battles, which were relatively brief, but on roads, which were almost continuous. The Grande Armée in its operational prime could march at a rate that contemporary military observers found almost incomprehensible, covering 20 to 30 kilometers per Dalton Y in good conditions, sometimes more during forced marches, which were what regular marches were called when they were faster and longer, and conducted under the threat of serious consequences for the soldiers who could not maintain pace. The strategic genius of Napoleon was, in significant part, a logistics genius, getting large numbers of men to places where they could fight before the enemy expected them, which required moving large numbers of men at speeds that the enemy did not expect. The men who moved at these speeds did not experience the movement as a strategic achievement. They experienced it as walking. You have been walking for 4 days. The road in front of you is the same road it was 4 days ago, which is to say it is a track that was designed for carts and has been converted by the passage of approximately 40,000 men and their associated animals and equipment into something that resembles, in dry weather, a deeply rutted corridor of dust, and in wet weather, a trough of mud that would challenge a man not carrying 40 pounds of equipment to cross without incident. You are carrying 40 pounds of equipment. The knapsack on your back contains your rations, your spare shirt, your cartridges, your cleaning equipment for the musket, and your half of the tent canvas that you share with your tent mate, whose name is Jean-Pierre or Hans-Ur Wuxich, depending on which army you have joined, and whose feet are in approximately the same condition as yours, which is to say not good. Your musket is across your shoulder, your cartridge box is at your hip, your bayonet is at your other hip. Your total load, including the uniform itself, is between 35 and 50 pounds, depending on what stage of the campaign you are at and how much of your ration you have already eaten. The ration, officially, was 1 pound of bread per Dalton Yoy, half a pound of meat, and some quantity of vegetables or legumes. This was the official ration. The actual ration varied considerably from the official ration in ways that consistently favoured reducing rather than increasing. The bread was often not bread, in the sense that it was a baked product made from grain. It was bread, in the sense that it was the kind of bread that the word bread implies to a person who has eaten bread under normal circumstances. It was sometimes a close approximation, and sometimes not. Biscuit was more reliable than bread because it had already been subjected to the drying process that was going to happen to the bread anyway over the 3 days between baking and eating. The difference between fresh biscuit and old biscuit was noticeable. The difference between fresh biscuit and fresh bread was even more noticeable. Neither was available, frequently enough to form the basis of a preference. The meat ration was more variable still. In the early campaigns, when the supply system was functioning, and the army was moving through territory that had not yet been stripped of its resources by previous armies, the meat ration was real meat, salt pork or beef, distributed to companies who then cooked it themselves over communal fires in the evening halt. In the later campaigns, particularly in Spain and Russia, the meat ration was whatever the men could find when the official supply had run out, which was the default condition in those theatres. In Spain, this meant chickens from farms whose owners did not consent to the transaction, and sometimes the farmers themselves objected more strongly than the chickens, which created its own set of complications. In Russia, in 1812, the meat ration was horse. Not because horse was a planned component of the supply system, but because horses were dying faster than they could be replaced, and a dead horse was a resource that a starving army could not afford to waste on sentiment. You ate the horse. You ate the horse without ceremony and without pleasure in most cases, though some soldiers reported that after several days without meat, horse tasted fine. It tasted like something. After several days without meat, something tasted like a significant improvement over nothing. The subject of hunger in the Napoleonic Wars is not a footnote. It is a central operational fact. The French army's logistic system operated on the assumption that armies could live off the land to a substantial degree, supplementing centralized supply with local acquisition. This worked, more or less, in northern Italy in the 1790s, where the country was productive and the campaigns were fast. It worked less well in Spain, where the country was less productive, the campaigns were slower, and the population was actively hostile, and had developed considerable skill at concealing food from armies of any nationality. It worked catastrophically in Russia, where the country was enormous. The population retreated with the army they were opposing, and the Kutuzov strategy of simply moving back and taking the food supply with them produced a situation in which the French army advanced into a countryside that contained nothing to eat and emerged from it in a condition that suggests the strategy was correct. Officially, the supply system existed. Unofficially, the supply system was the land. And when the land had nothing, the supply system had nothing. And the army marched on the memory of food. You learn to think about food in a different way on campaign. At home, in the village, food was a background condition of life, something that appeared at meals and was present between meals in the form of the smell of the kitchen and the knowledge of where the bread was, and the comfortable certainty that it would be there again. On campaign, food becomes foreground. It occupies the thoughts, the way weather occupies the thoughts of a person walking in weather, constantly present, constantly relevant, constantly the subject of calculation. How much do you have? How long will it last? How far until the next issue? Whether the rumour about the village 2 kilometres off the road has anything to it. Whether the man who went to investigate the rumour will come back with anything, or will come back empty and have to explain himself to a sergeant who has also been thinking about food all day and is not inclined toward charitable interpretations. The water was as important as the food and substantially more dangerous. The Napoleonic army's relationship with water was mediated entirely by proximity and practicality. You drank from the sources available, which were rivers, streams, village wells, and whatever else you could find, and the quality of those sources varied from adequate to lethal, depending on circumstances that you had no reliable method of assessing in the field. Dysentery was the constant companion of every Napoleonic campaign. Not a risk. A companion. Present, persistent, reducing combat effectiveness in ways that the official casualty records do not capture, because soldiers who could not fight due to severe gastrointestinal illness were often not formally classified as casualties, unless the illness progressed to death, which it did in a significant percentage of cases. The British Army in Spain lost more men to disease than to enemy action. The French Army in Russia lost enormous numbers to typhus, which is transmitted by the body louse. And the body louse was present in every army of the period because the conditions that prevented its spread were not available to men sleeping in their uniforms on the ground, in the company of 40,000 other men sleeping in their uniforms on the ground. Which sounds X until you realize why. The body louse sounds like a minor indignity, a nuisance, something you scratched at and complained about in your letters home. If you were literate enough to write letters home, which perhaps a third of French conscripts were. The body louse was in fact a vector for epidemic typhus, which killed somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people in the Russian campaign of 1812 alone. More than the fighting, more than the cold, more than the starvation, though all three were also killing people, often simultaneously, on the retreat from Moscow. The body louse did not announce itself as a strategic factor. It was just there, in the seam of your coat, in the wool of your blanket if you had a blanket, on the bodies of the men sleeping next to you, conducting its own persistent campaign against the health of every army it accompanied, and succeeding at a rate that would have embarrassed most generals. Your feet are the other thing worth discussing at length because they are the subject of most of what your daily experience is actually about during the marching phases of the campaign. You are a foot soldier in the literal sense, that your feet are the mechanism by which you exist as a military unit. Without functioning feet you cannot march. Without the march, you are not an army. The connection between the condition of your feet and the outcome of the campaign is not metaphorical. It is direct, mechanical, and well understood by every soldier who has marched more than 40 kilometers in standard issue boots. The boots. Let us spend a moment with the boots. The standard French army boot of the Napoleonic period was made of leather, constructed to a last that may or may not have corresponded to the foot it was assigned to, and issued in a system that did not always match the boot to the foot in the obvious size. Related sense. There was no left and no right in the construction of most military boots of this period. Both boots were identical, and the understanding was that you would break them into the appropriate shape through the natural process of wearing them until your feet told the leather what shape they needed to be. This process was accurate. It was also extremely painful while it was happening, and produced a range of foot injuries, from blisters in the early stages to more serious skin breakdown in the later stages, that were the single most reliable source of non-combat casualties in every Napoleonic campaign. Blisters are not dramatic. They are not the kind of injury that appears in accounts of military heroism. They are, however, the kind of injury that stopped armies, or more precisely, that thinned armies in the way that a long hike thins a hiking group, not by dramatic attrition, but by the slow accumulation of people who simply cannot continue. A blister becomes an open wound on a foot that is inside a boot that is marching through unpaved roads that have been churned to mud or dust by 40,000 men, and their horses becomes an infected wound. An infected wound on a foot in the field, in the Napoleonic period, before antibiotics, without reliable access to clean water or wound care, became a serious medical problem with a range of outcomes of which recovery was one and amputation was another, and death was a third. The men who left the column because they could not march often did not rejoin it. This was understood. It was factored into the operational planning in the sense that attrition on the march was expected, and the army was sized to absorb a certain percentage of it. The individual men who made up the attrition statistic had their own experience of the process, which was not statistical. You stop for the night at what would generously be described as a field. It has grass in it. In some directions it is bounded by trees. There is a stream somewhere nearby, audible if not yet visible, which is the most important piece of information about this location, and the reason the column has stopped here. The sergeants are moving through the column, indicating where each company is to bivouac. Your company is in a portion of the field that is currently indistinguishable from the rest of the field. You put down your pack. This act produces a physical sensation that is difficult to describe to someone who has not spent the previous 10 hours carrying 40 pounds through variable terrain. But the nearest approximation is, it feels as if someone has removed the field from your shoulders. Your body reorganizes itself around the absence of the weight, with a gratitude that is not metaphorical. You and your tent mate set up the tent, which is a half tent, each man carrying one half, which fit together to form a small two-man shelter that was adequate to keep off light rain and inadequate in most other meteorological situations. If it rained hard, you were wet. If it was cold, the tent provided minimal insulation because canvas does not insulate. It only blocks wind, and you were sleeping on the ground, which drew heat from your body at a rate that the canvas over your head did nothing to address. A fire was better than no fire when fires were permitted, which was not always. Fires were visible. A burning bivouac told an enemy scout exactly where the army was and how large it was. And while the army of 40,000 men was not exactly concealing its location, there were tactical situations in which the commanding general preferred that the fires not be lit. On those nights, you slept in the tent on the cold ground in your uniform, which was wet if it had rained, and waited for the morning in the way that people wait for things they cannot accelerate and can only endure. The morning came before you were ready for it, as mornings on campaign always did. Not the comfortable waking of a civilian life, with time to orient yourself and consider the day, but the abrupt and compulsory waking of a man who has been told he has 20 minutes to strike camp, eat if he has anything to eat, and be ready to march. 20 minutes was generous. Some mornings it was 15. The army moved on the schedule of its commanding general, and the commanding general's schedule was determined by strategic considerations that did not include the state of your feet or the quantity of your sleep. You were up. You were moving. The column was reforming on the road, and you were part of the column, marching again, your feet registering their opinions about this development in the usual way. The days developed a rhythm that was monotonous in the specific way that the word monotonous does not quite capture, because monotony implies a sameness that is tolerable by virtue of its predictability, and the sameness of marching was not tolerable in that way. It was simply the condition. You marched. The road was in front of you and behind you, and it was the same road in both directions, the same dust or mud, the same ruts, the same backs of the men in front of you, the same sounds of equipment and feet, and the occasional orders called down the column by officers who were mounted, and therefore seeing a version of the march that bore no physical relationship to the version you were experiencing. You marched and you thought about food, and you thought about your feet, and you thought about where you were going, and what was going to happen when you got there, and you thought about home, which was not a sentimental thought, but a practical one, a place where the food was available, and your feet were not being destroyed, and the ground you slept on was a bed. The relationship between marching soldiers and the civilian populations they moved through is one of the more complicated aspects of the Napoleonic Wars, and one that the official histories tend to handle carefully. The official position was that the army paid for what it requisitioned, and that discipline was maintained, and that the soldiers were the representatives of a civilization and conducted themselves accordingly. The actual position varied. In France itself, and in territories that Napoleon controlled and wished to retain the loyalty of, the rules about civilian property were enforced with real consequences. In enemy territory, or in territory that had been designated as fair game by circumstances or by the desperation of an army that had not been properly supplied, the rules were applied, selectively. In Spain, they were largely decorative. In Russia, in 1812, they ceased to be meaningful once the supply system collapsed, which happened relatively early in the campaign and progressively worsened as the army moved deeper into territory that the Russians had systematically stripped of everything consumable. The Spanish campaign, which ran from 1808 to 1814, and is sometimes treated as a sideshow to the Russian campaign, but was in terms of French casualties and strategic impact anything but a sideshow, introduced the French army to a form of warfare for which its training and doctrine were essentially unprepared. The Spanish guerrilla was not a soldier in the conventional sense, not a man in a uniform who stood in a formation and fired according to the conventions of 18th century linear warfare, a farmer who buried his food and hid his horses and then waited with people who knew the terrain and had been living in it all their lives, for the moment when a small French detachment was isolated from its regiment and vulnerable. The guerrilla killed in ways that the formal military culture of the period found deeply uncomfortable, not because killing was uncomfortable, but because the killing was being done outside the rules that made it categorizable as warfare rather than murder. And the distinction between the two categories was one that the French army had a strong professional interest in maintaining. You do not encounter a guerrilla directly most of the time. What you encounter is the consequence of the guerrilla's activities. The courier who did not arrive, the supply convoy that was ambushed and destroyed, the detachment that went to requisition grain from a village and did not come back. The Spanish countryside, which had seemed in the first weeks of the campaign merely poor and difficult, gradually revealed itself to be actively hostile in ways that went beyond the poverty. Every farmhouse potentially concealed a weapon. Every road through a defile was potentially an ambush. Every local who agreed to guide you to the next village was potentially guiding you somewhere else. The army moved through Spain in a state of background alertness that formal military training did not quite prepare for, because formal military training was about battles, and Spain was mostly not battles. Spain was about managing the chronic uncertainty of movement through territory that wanted you gone. The relationship between the French army and Spain produced, on the French side, a variety of responses that range from professional competence to documented atrocity, and the range is important to note because neither end of it captures the whole truth. There were French soldiers in Spain who behaved with the discipline and restraint that their officers demanded, and that the situation made extremely difficult to maintain. There were French soldiers in Spain who did not, and the consequences for Spanish civilians were serious and are documented in the records of both sides. The Peninsular War is the context in which Goya painted the Disasters of War series, which are available to look at, and which constitute one of the more direct historical records of what this conflict looked like from the civilian perspective of the people it was happening to. The paintings are not comfortable. They are not supposed to be. They were made by someone who saw what they depict. But let us stay with you, the soldier, because tonight is about the soldier. You have been in Spain for 3 months. Your boots are in a condition that would alarm a cobbler. Your uniform coat, which was blue when you were issued it, and has since passed through several shades of blue toward a general greyish state that reflects accumulated mud and smoke and the residue of everything that has happened to it, has been patched in 2 places by yourself, and in 1 place by your tent mate, whose stitching is considerably worse than yours. You have lost 8 pounds since you left the depot, which is roughly the amount that a man loses when he is marching continuously on a reduced ration, and your face shows it in the way that the faces of men on campaign show the mathematics of their situation. You do not look like the soldiers in the paintings. The soldiers in the paintings look like soldiers in paintings. You have been in 1 battle. This is worth describing carefully. because the description of battles in the Napoleonic Wars tends toward the dramatic and the comprehensible, and the actual experience of participating in one was neither. You were in a line. Your regiment was in a line, 2 or 3 ranks deep, which put you either in the front rank, able to fire, or in the rear ranks, unable to fire but required to be there as a physical mass that added weight to the formation and replaced casualties in the front rank as they occurred, which was the tactful word for what happened to people in the front rank. The line was 600 metres wide. The regiment facing you was 600 metres wide. The distance between your line and their line was closing. You had been told that this was a victory, not in those words. The officers had explained the plan, which was that your division would advance, and the enemy would be unable to hold their position, and the outcome would be the capture of the high ground beyond the enemy line, which would make the subsequent operations considerably easier. This plan was explained with confidence. The confidence was real, not performed, because the officers who explained it had done the calculation and believed it was correct. The calculation may have been correct. The calculation did not address what it was going to feel like to be one of the elements of the plan in the 20 minutes before the outcome was determined. The noise was the first thing, not a single noise, but a layered noise, artillery in the distance, and artillery nearby, and musket fire that started as a scattered rattling, and built to a continuous roar that was so loud that you could not hear the man next to you speak at normal volume, and could not hear orders unless they were shouted directly into your ear. The smoke was the second thing. Musket fire produced a large amount of black powder smoke, and the smoke of 40,000 muskets firing in an enclosed space produced a visibility reduction that was almost total within the first 10 minutes of sustained fire. You could see the backs of the men in front of you, and you could see, dimly, through the smoke, a shape that might be the enemy line, or might be the smoke itself forming shapes. You aimed at the shape and fired and reloaded and fired again. You could not tell whether you had hit anything. You could not tell, most of the time, whether the shape you were aiming at was still there. You fired because that was what you were there to do, and the alternative was to stop firing and stand in the smoke doing nothing while the other side continued, which was not an option that presented itself as reasonable. The man next to you was hit, not dramatically. He sat down. This was the common way. A man who had been standing was suddenly not standing, and you closed the gap he left because the formation required it, and because the alternative was to stand in a gap in the formation which made you the most exposed person in the line, which was a situation with obvious disadvantages. You did not stop to look at him. The situation did not have stopping in it. The fighting had its own momentum, its own pace, and the pace did not have room for the individual incidents that were composing it. You fired, you reloaded, you fired again. The man on your other side said something you could not hear over the noise, and you nodded, because that seemed like the correct response to something you could not hear. At some point, the enemy line broke and advanced or retreated, and at some other point, the officers were shouting something that resolved into a forward movement, and you moved forward through the smoke into the area where the enemy line had been. And the ground there was different from the ground you had been standing on, different in ways that you registered without dwelling on, because dwelling on them served no operational purpose, and the operational purpose was to continue forward and secure the high ground. That was the objective of the action. You secured the high ground. The battle ended. Not A, B, not the dramatic conclusion of the paintings with the flags and the triumphant general on the horse, but the gradual quieting of the musket fire and the dispersal of the smoke and the view that emerged when the smoke cleared, which was a field with things on it that had not been there before, and officers moving about making assessments, and soldiers sitting down wherever there was space to sit. Officially, it was a victory. The high ground was yours. The enemy had retreated. The subsequent operations would indeed be easier. Unofficially, your regiment had taken casualties at a rate that you had not fully understood was possible before you experienced it, and the men who had been standing next to you an hour ago were present in different quantities, and in some cases in different configurations than they had been before. And the process of accounting for this was something the sergeants were conducting in the middle distance, in a businesslike way that suggested it was a routine task, which it was. It was a routine task. That was the thing about it. The medical care that followed was available in the sense that it existed, and not available in the sense that it could serve everyone who needed it, which was a larger population than the available resources could address. The field surgeon of the Napoleonic period was not the inadequate butcher of popular history, but he was not a modern physician either. He was a trained practitioner operating under conditions that made his training the least limiting factor in his ability to help people. The limiting factors were time, equipment, anesthesia, which did not exist, and antiseptic understanding, which was incomplete. He could amputate. Amputation, performed quickly and correctly, saved lives that could not otherwise be saved when a limb was shattered by a musket ball, in a way that made repair impossible and infection inevitable. The speed of the amputation, which seems from the modern perspective like barbarism, was in fact a mercy. Less than 2 minutes for a skilled surgeon meant less exposure to the pain, less blood loss, less time in the state of consciousness during which the process was happening. What the surgeon could not do was treat infection systematically, because the germ theory of disease was not yet established, and the connection between wound contamination and subsequent infection was understood empirically by experienced surgeons, but not theoretically by anyone. Wounds that looked clean became infected. Infected wounds produced fever, and, if the infection reached the bloodstream, the result was sepsis, which the period understood as a distinct syndrome, but could not treat beyond supportive care and hope. Men who survived the battle and the amputation died in the days following, at a rate the surgical ward a place that had its own characteristic mortality curve, peaking about 5 days after the operation. You knew this. Everyone knew this, in the way that everyone knows the things that happen around them repeatedly and constitute the normal conditions of their situation. The surgical ward was a place you hoped not to visit, and if you visited it, a place you hoped to leave quickly, and quickly had a specific meaning in this context. There is a number that is important to hold on to for the rest of this conversation. In the Napoleonic Wars, approximately 1 in 5 of all military deaths was caused by battle. 4 in 5 were caused by disease. The numbers vary by campaign and by army and by year, but the ratio holds broadly across the conflict. The enemy's weapons were the smaller cause of death. The environment's pathogens were the larger. This was not unknown in the period. Military medical officers wrote about it. Commanding generals were aware of it. It did not change the fundamental structure of how armies operated, because the structural changes necessary to address it were not available. Changing water sources was not possible when armies were moving. Changing sleeping arrangements was not possible when armies were camping in the field. Changing the diet to prevent scurvy required a supply chain that did not exist for most of the conflict. Teat. The soldiers died of typhus and dysentery and pneumonia and wound infection and scurvy and simple exposure, and the armies replaced them with new conscripts, and the campaigns continued. You write a letter home, if you are literate enough to write a letter and have access to the materials necessary to write one, both of which are conditions that apply to a portion, but not the majority of soldiers in this army. The letter home is a specific genre of communication with its own conventions, and the conventions are not primarily about accuracy. You write that you are well, because writing that you are not well would alarm people to no purpose and would not improve the situation. You write that you are eating adequately, because the alternative requires an explanation of the supply system that would take longer than the available paper. You write that you are hopeful about the outcome of the campaign, which is what you have been told by people in a position to express opinions about outcomes, whether or not you believe it. What you do not write is the specifics, the boots, the feet, the man who sat down next to you, the smell of the surgical ward from the outside. The letter that arrived at your family's village was a document of survival and reassurance. It was also, in most cases, a selective representation of the situation that was kind to the recipient and true in only the most important way, which was that you were alive to write it. The letters that did not arrive told a different story by their absence. A family waiting for a letter knew what the absence of a letter might mean, and the process of converting the might into certainty was slow and unofficial, because the notification system for Napoleonic casualties was not designed to minimize the duration of family uncertainty. It was designed, insofar as it was designed at all, to process the operational consequences of casualties, the redistribution of equipment, the recording of the name, the adjustment of the regimental roles. The family was an administrative afterthought. The letter that did not arrive was the family's primary notification, and the family's primary response to its non-arrival was to wait for another letter that might explain the absence of the previous one, and if that letter did not arrive either, to begin the process of understanding that was not an administrative process, but a private one, conducted in a village, far from wherever the regiment was, with no date of resolution and no official ceremony. The camaraderie between soldiers in this army was real, and has been documented extensively by the soldiers themselves, in letters and in the memoirs, that some of them wrote after the wars ended, and it is worth taking seriously because it was one of the primary things that made the experience survivable. Not survivable in the mortality sense, since a great many of the men who experienced this camaraderie did not survivable, in the sense that human experience under severe conditions is made bearable by the presence of other humans who are experiencing the same conditions and who can provide both practical help and the specific comfort of being understood without explanation. Your tent mate knew your feet were bad because his feet were also bad. He knew you had not slept properly in 3 nights because he also had not slept properly in 3 nights. He knew the shape of your hunger because the shape of his hunger was the same shape, produced by the same ration at the same time, over the same march distance. This shared knowledge created a kind of communication that did not require words, or required fewer words than ordinary social communication, and the efficiency of this communication was itself a comfort. You did not need to explain yourself to this man. He was where you were. He had seen what you had seen. The conversation you had with him in the evenings, over whatever fire was available, about whatever subjects came up, was different from any other conversation in your life, because it was happening between 2 people who had the same information about the world they were currently in. This is not romanticism. It is a documented phenomenon with practical consequences. Units with high cohesion performed better in battle and had lower rates of individual collapse, desertion, and the forms of psychological breakdown that the period did not have good language for, but that the military medical records describe obliquely as melancholy or nervous collapse, or simply the unwillingness to continue. The men who broke were often not the weakest men in physical terms. They were the men who were alone in the specific sense that the presence of others who knew your situation provides a kind of support that individual resilience cannot substitute for. The man who deserted in Spain or in Russia was, in most cases, not a coward in any simple sense. He was a man for whom the combination of the situation and the isolation had exceeded what he could manage, and the line between the man who deserted and the man who did not was often drawn not by character, but by the accident of which company he was in, and whether the men in that company were still alive. Desertion was common enough to be a standing problem in every army of the period, and rare enough to be treated as a serious crime when it was caught. The penalty was, depending on the army and the circumstances and the discretion of the commanding officer, death, corporal punishment, or assignment to the most dangerous duties, the last of which was a sentence with a predictable direction, if not a predictable timeline. The French army shot deserters when it caught them, and it caught a fraction of the deserters it produced, and the desertions continued anyway, which tells you something about the relative weight of the deterrent and the conditions that produced the behavior it was meant to prevent. Officially, the death penalty prevented desertion. Unofficially, the conditions of the campaign produced deserters faster than the death penalty could process them, and the commanding generals knew this, and managed it, and mostly kept the information out of the correspondence that would have reached Paris. The officers existed in a different version of the same world, not a comfortable version, because the mortality rate among officers in Napoleonic battles was very high. The convention of leading from the front being both a genuine professional norm and a strategy for maintaining unit cohesion in the smoke and noise of battle, where the men needed to be able to see someone and follow them. But a different version, the officer ate differently, slept differently, travelled differently, and was treated by the medical system differently. Not because the rules said these things exactly, but because they were true in the way that social hierarchy is true, in practice, even when official policy is more egalitarian than the practice. The man who could get to the surgeon first was the man with a horse. The man with a horse was not you. The class structure of the Napoleonic army is its own subject, and cannot be fully treated in one night. But the short version is this. Napoleon had created a system that was, by the standards of the 18th century, remarkably open to advancement on merit, and the Imperial Guard and the officer corps contained men whose origins were genuinely humble, and who had risen because of demonstrated competence. This was real, and it was understood to be one of the things that motivated the army. Simultaneously, the officer class was not identical to the enlisted class in any operational way, and the gap in physical conditions between the two groups was wide enough that the shared experience of a campaign was, in some respects, the experience of 2 different campaigns being conducted in proximity to each other. You marched, they rode. You ate what was issued. They ate from a different supply. You slept in a half tent. They slept in a tent that was a whole tent, or in a requisitioned building, or in a farmhouse, whose owners were informed of the arrangement after the fact. Officially, they were in the same army. Unofficially, they were in the same army, the way that passengers in first class and steerage are on the same ship. The Grande Armée at its peak in 1812, the campaign year that ended everything, was approximately 680,000 men. Of these, approximately 300,000 were French. The rest were Germans, Poles, Austrians, Prussians, Italians, Spaniards, Dutch, Swiss, and a variety of other nationalities from the nations that Napoleon had absorbed into his empire, or allied to it by force or negotiation. You might be any of these men. The multinational composition of the army created its own complications, in addition to the logistical and tactical ones. You could not necessarily talk to the man next to you, not because either of you was uncommunicative, but because the army contained regiments that spoke no common language with the regiments next to them, and the command structure that was supposed to bridge this gap was in French, which was the language of the officer class, and not necessarily the language of the men being commanded. You followed orders transmitted through a chain that may have included one or more translation steps, and the fidelity of translation in a battle was limited by the same noise and smoke and confusion that limited everything else. The Russian campaign of 1812 is the event that the Napoleonic Wars are most commonly remembered by, and it is worth approaching carefully because the reality of it was so extreme that description tends toward either understatement, which fails to convey what happened, or overstatement, which tends toward the dramatic and away from the specific. The specific is what matters tonight. You entered Russia in June of 1812 as part of an army that was, in its initial composition, probably the largest single military force that had been assembled in European history to that point. The weather in June in what is now Western Russia was summer weather, which meant it was hot, dusty, and suitable for rapid movement. The army moved. The Russians retreated. This was not what Napoleon had planned for, which was a decisive battle early in the campaign that would force a Russian decision quickly. And the Russian refusal to provide this battle was either brilliant strategy or the only option available to an army that could not face the Grand Aid Arm directly, depending on your interpretation. What it meant in operational terms was that the army kept moving east, farther into Russia, with supply lines extending and the territory ahead of it increasingly stripped of anything that could support a large force. The campaign reached Smolensk in August and Moscow in September. The distance from the Polish border to Moscow is approximately 900 kilometers. In 3 months, the army had covered 900 kilometers, which was a genuine strategic and physical achievement, and which had cost, before a single major battle, approximately 150,000 men to disease, starvation, and the attrition of the march. Not A, B, not defeat, not any enemy action, but the road and the heat and the bad water and the organisms that lived in the bad water, and the lack of food and the accumulated physical damage of 3 months of hard marching in conditions that the supply system had not anticipated correctly. Moscow burned. Not because Napoleon's army burned it, though some of his men participated in the looting that followed the Russian evacuation, but because the Russians burned it, or some Russians burned it, the subject of who exactly started the fire being disputed by everyone involved, and probably involving multiple independent decisions in multiple locations, producing a fire that destroyed the city that was supposed to provide the army with its winter quarters and its logistical base. Translation: the army that had marched 900 kilometers to reach Moscow arrived at Moscow and found Moscow on fire. This was not the planned outcome. The retreat from Moscow began in October. By this point, the season had changed. The Russian autumn, which transitions to Russian winter with less warning than Western European climates provide, was producing temperatures that the army's equipment was not designed for. Not because the army had been equipped for warmth in winter exactly, but because the assumption had been that the campaign would be over before winter was a relevant consideration. And the assumption was wrong. You retreated in the clothes you had marched in the boots you had marched in the coat that had been adequate in June, and was not adequate in November, across a landscape that had already been stripped of food and shelter on the way in, and was now covered in snow that had been, in many places, the first snow of a winter that was going to be the coldest in living memory. The temperature on the retreat reached -37 degrees Celsius on some recorded days. At -37, exposed skin freezes in minutes. At -20, which was more typical, exposed skin freezes in somewhat longer than minutes, but still not in any comfortable amount of time. Frostbite at these temperatures is not the mild peripheral numbness of cold weather in a temperate climate. It is the actual death of tissue, permanent, often requiring amputation of the affected limbs, fingers, toes, ears, noses, producing in the survivors of the Russian campaign a specific and recognizable physical record of where they had been, that they carried for the rest of their lives. The men who could not continue the retreat simply stopped, not dramatically, not with a speech or a decision that presented itself as a decision. They sat down because they were too cold and too exhausted and too depleted to continue. And at the temperatures of the Russian winter, sitting down was the last voluntary act before the cold completed the process that hunger and exhaustion had begun. The army that entered Russia with 680,000 men ended the campaign having lost, through battle and disease and starvation, and the cold and the guerrilla attacks of the Cossacks, who accompanied the retreat and harvested its stragglers, approximately 550,000. The men who made it back crossed into Poland, having been in Russia for approximately 5 months, and were, by almost any measure you could apply, not the same men who had entered. You were not in Russia, most of you. The majority of Napoleonic soldiers served in France or Germany, or Spain or Italy, in campaigns that were severe without being apocalyptic, which is a meaningful distinction when the alternative is the Russian campaign. But the Russian campaign casts a shadow over the whole period, because it was what the system produced, at its extreme. The largest army ever assembled, the most ambitious operational plan, the most complete operational failure, the most total human cost. It answered the question of what happened when the things that kept the Napoleonic system functional, the speed, the logistics, the unit cohesion, the tactical flexibility, were all degraded simultaneously beyond the point where the system could compensate for any of them. Waterloo was 3 years later, in 1815, and it was the last battle, not the A-B of a completed story, but the ending that arrived, as endings in wars often do, through a combination of circumstances that nobody planned and that were recognized as an ending only after the fact. You are at Waterloo in June of 1815, if you are still alive, which many soldiers from the beginning of this period are not, having been used up by the years of campaigning in ways that do not always show in the official records. The night before Waterloo it rained. A heavy, persistent rain that lasted through the night and into the morning of the battle, soaking the battlefield that the two armies were positioned on and turning the clay soil into a consistency that made movement difficult and artillery movement nearly impossible. You spent the night of the 17th of June to 18th in the rain, in the field, in the clothes you had been wearing for however many days, since the last change of clothes had been possible. The rain came down at the same rate, whether you were a sergeant with 20 years of service or a conscript in his first campaign, and it pooled in the low ground between your position and the enemy's position, and the dawn of the 18th of June revealed a battlefield that was not the battlefield anyone would have chosen, which was true in its various ways, of almost every significant engagement in the whole 12 years of this conflict. The Battle of Waterloo lasted approximately 8 hours. Approximately 50,000 men were killed or wounded on the French side, and approximately 23,000 on the Allied side, with the Prussian forces that arrived late in the battle contributing their own casualties to the total. By any standard you choose to apply, this was a very large number of people experiencing very serious physical harm in a very short time over a very small geographic area. The area of the battlefield was approximately a few square kilometers. The density of suffering in that area, per square kilometer, per H-hour, was extraordinary in the precise numerical sense. The aftermath of Waterloo was, like the aftermath of every Napoleonic battle, a field containing the consequence of the preceding several hours which required management. The wounded who could be reached and treated were reached and treated. The wounded who could not be reached in time were not. The dead were buried when conditions permitted burying them, which at Waterloo was not immediately. The battle ended on a Sunday evening. The burials extended through the following week. In the interval, the battlefield was the subject of the attentions of the local population, who took the practical view that military equipment left on a battlefield was military equipment available to whoever picked it up, and conducted a thorough survey of the available materials. The teeth of the dead were removed by specialists who sold them to dentists who used them to make dentures. This is documented. It sounds like a detail from a different kind of story than the one usually told about Waterloo. It is not. It is one of the most honest details available about what the end of a battle actually looked like. Napoleon abdicated on the 22nd of June. The wars were over. The men who survived them went home, or went to whatever destination had become home by the time the fighting stopped, which was not always the place they had started from, because 12 years of war at this scale rearranges geography in ways that affect where home is. The veterans who returned to France or Germany or Poland returned to villages that had aged 12 years in their absence, that contained in many cases fewer of the people who had been there when they left, that were organized around an economy that had changed, and that contained their return as an unexpected variable. There was no formal ceremony for most of them. Not not a parade in their village, not a speech by the mayor, not the formal acknowledgement that they had gone, and returned, and that this round trip was an achievement worth marking. Some of the senior officers received honours, as officers in victorious or defeated armies typically do. The enlisted men received their discharge papers and the instruction to return to civilian life, which was an instruction that presupposed a civilian life ready to receive them, which was in many cases not quite accurate. A man who had left his village at 22 and returned at 34 had missed 12 years of the ordinary social development of a person in that community. The marriages, the children, the establishment of a place in the economic and social structure, the accumulation of the small relationships and obligations and histories that constitute a life in a village. He had other things. He had 12 years of a different kind of experience. The two sets of experience did not translate between each other smoothly, and the adjustment was private, conducted without institutional support, because the institutional systems of the period had no mechanism for what we would now call reintegration, and would not have recognized the need for one. The men who had gone together, who had marched together and slept in the same hearth, tents and eaten the same inadequate rations, and stood in the same lines in the smoke, often sought each other out afterward, not only because of the camaraderie, though that was part of it, also because the experience they shared was one that could not be communicated to people who had not shared it, in the same way that very specific experiences cannot be communicated to people who have not had them, and the presence of someone who already understood saved the work of explanation that could never, in any case, be complete. The veterans of the Napoleonic Wars formed associations. They told each other stories that they did not tell their families. They lived out the second half of their lives in the ordinary way, with ordinary concerns, and the first half was something they carried in the specific way that carried things become part of the body. Present, weighty, no longer consciously noticed, but there. Let's go back to the beginning, before the march, before Russia, before any of it, and talk about conscription, because the experience of the Napoleonic Wars begins there for most of the men in this story, and the beginning shapes everything that follows. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic governments introduced, or more precisely systematized and expanded, a form of national military service that was new in European history, the levée en masse, the principle that the nation itself was the army, and every able-bodied man was a potential soldier, not by choice or by profession, but by citizenship. This was, in its conception, a democratic idea, not a king's army of professionals and mercenaries, but a people's army of citizens. In its execution, it was a system for taking men from their homes and farms and workshops and putting them in boots on roads in countries they had never heard of, at a rate determined by the strategic needs of a campaigns planner in Paris, rather than by the preferences of the men being conscripted. The conscription process was not subtle. Each département of France was assigned a quota of men. The men were selected by lottery from the eligible age cohort, which was initially set at 20 to 25, but was expanded as the wars progressed, and the attrition accumulated, and the available pool of 20 to 25 year-olds diminished relative to the demand. By 1813, after 20 years of continuous warfare, France was conscripting 17-year-olds and men in their 40s. The system that had begun as a mobilization of citizens had become, by the end, a mobilization of whoever was left. The men who were selected had options that ranged from compliance to resistance, and the range was used. A man who could pay for a replacement, a rempliant, could legally avoid service by purchasing the military obligation of another man who was willing to go in his place, which was a system that confirmed what the rhetoric of citizen soldiering denied, that the burden of the wars fell disproportionately on the men who could not afford to pay someone else to bear it. The wealthy sent substitutes. The poor went themselves, or ran, or found a sympathetic local official who could be persuaded that the quota was already met, or disappeared into a city where the conscription authorities could not easily find them. The refractaires, the men who evaded conscription, were a known phenomenon of the Napoleonic period, documented in the police records as a social problem, and addressed by gendarmerie sweeps of the countryside, that were themselves a form of small violence, applied to communities that had already contributed significant proportions of their male population to the wars. Your mother knew what the draft notice meant. She had watched it happen to other families. She had possibly watched it happen to your father in an earlier campaign, and received back from the campaign whatever version of your father the campaign produced, which might have been the man who left, or might have been a modified version of him, or might have been nothing, because the campaign did not produce every man who entered it in returnable condition. She had practical knowledge of what the system required of the people it processed. She gave you whatever she could give you, the extra shirt, the coin she had saved. the food she had prepared for the first days before the army's supply took over the feeding. What she could not give you was a way out of what was coming, because ways out of what was coming required money or connections that most families did not have. She watched you leave. You walked down the road toward the assembly point. The village was behind you, and then it was not visible, and the village's knowledge of your existence, after that point, depended on the letters that might or might not arrive. The assembly point was a town, and at the town there was a temporary depot where the new conscripts were gathered before being assigned to regiments and marched to join the campaign. The depot was an institution that contained several hundred men at various stages of the same transition you were making, from civilian to soldier, and the institution's approach to this transition was primarily logistical. You were measured for your uniform. You were issued your equipment. You were assigned to a company. You were drilled in the basic movements, and you were dispatched. The psychological dimensions of the transition were not a significant concern of the depot administration, not because the administrators were indifferent in any personal sense, but because the system they were administering did not have a mechanism for addressing them and was operating at a scale that made individual attention impossible. The drill was the part that was most transformative in the functional sense. Drilling taught you to follow orders at a mechanical level below the level of deliberate decision, making so that a command could be executed without the delay of conscious processing. This was not an accident. The tactical system of the period depended on men executing commands in the noise and confusion of battle, where deliberate decision making was not available, and the drill produced the conditioned responses that made execution possible. You learned to march in step, to wheel in formation, to load and fire in sequence, to respond to the drum beats that carried commands, across distances too great for voice. After 6 weeks of this, the movements were automatic in the way that all sufficiently repeated physical actions become automatic, present in the body rather than in the mind, executable under conditions that would not support mind-based activity. The drum deserves its own discussion, because it was the primary communication technology of the Napoleonic battlefield, and it was not decorative. The drum carried the commands that voice could not carry through. The noise of battle, advance, halt, form, square, retreat, fire by ranks. The drummer was therefore not a ceremonial figure, but an operational one, and the death of a regiment's drummer in the middle of a battle was a tactical problem of immediate significance. Regiments developed communication redundancies, but the central importance of the drum as a command medium meant that drummers were disproportionately targeted, and the life expectancy of a drummer in a sustained engagement was lower than the already not encouraging life expectancy of other soldiers in similar positions. The trumpet served the cavalry as the drum served the infantry, and the cavalry existed in a version of the Napoleonic Wars that differed from the infantry version in several important ways, all of which favoured the cavalry in comfort and disfavoured them in the specific hazards of their arm. You moved faster and more comfortably when the army moved. You were also, in battle, required to advance at high speed toward bodies of men who were going to shoot at you, which presented its own set of risks. The cavalry charge, which in paintings looks like the embodiment of military glory, was in practice a test of the proposition that a mass of horses and men moving at 30 kilometres per HR could close the distance to a firing line before the firing line could produce enough casualties to break the momentum of the charge. Sometimes the proposition was true. Sometimes it was not. The encounters between cavalry charges and infantry squares, which was the formation specifically designed to repel cavalry by presenting a wall of bayonets on all four sides, produced outcomes that were occasionally instructive to both parties about the limits of their respective arms. The horse itself was a military resource that received considerable institutional attention for practical reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment. A cavalry horse represented a significant financial investment and a logistical dependency that affected everything about how the cavalry operated. The horse ate grain, and a cavalry horse at work ate more grain than a farm horse at rest, and the grain supply for the horses competed with the supply for the men and was frequently the constraining factor in operational planning. In Russia, where the grain supply collapsed, the horses died. Not all at once, not dramatically, but consistently, at a rate that reduced the cavalry arm from its theoretical strength to a practical remnant, and that left, as noted, a supply of horse meat that became relevant to the infantry's nutritional situation in ways that neither arm would have chosen if alternatives had been available. The artillery was a third version of the same war, different again from both the infantry and cavalry versions. The artilleryman was a specialist in a way that the infantryman was not, trained in the operation of weapons whose effective use required mathematical knowledge, physical coordination, team discipline, and the ability to manage a complex technical process under conditions of violence and noise. The artillery was also in the Napoleonic system, unusually well organized and unusually well led. Napoleon himself came from the artillery, had a genuine technical interest in its capabilities, and had done more than any previous commander to integrate artillery systematically into the combined arms tactics that made the Grande Armée so effective in its prime years. The artillerymen knew they were something specialized. They were right to know this, but the artillerymen still slept in the field, still ate what was available, still marched when the army marched, or moved the guns when the army moved, which was worse in some ways because the guns had to be manhandled over roads that had not been designed for their weight, through mud that created a resistance that required the combined effort of the entire gun crew to overcome, on a schedule that was set by the army's movement, and not by the condition of the road or the state of the crew. Moving artillery in the Napoleonic period was hard physical labor performed continuously by men who were also required to be technically proficient when they arrived at the destination, which is a combination of demands that does not appear in the official descriptions of the arm, but that defined the daily reality of serving in it. The camp at night, whenever the army was not in forced march and a proper bivouac was possible, had a structure that developed over time into something close to a routine, which was important, because routine is one of the mechanisms by which human beings manage exposure to conditions that, if thought about directly and continuously, would be unmanageable. You knew what happened when the march halted. You knew the sequence: find your bivouac position, set up the tent, find water, build a fire if permitted, cook if there was something to cook, eat, maintain your equipment, sleep in the time that remained. The sequence was the same every evening, and the sameness was a structure that held the experience together in a way that made it possible to continue the next day, because the next day was going to be the same sequence, in reverse. Wake, strike camp, form up, march. The cooking, when it happened, was communal by practical necessity. Small groups of soldiers, typically the mess, which was a group of 5 or 6 men who shared cooking responsibilities and eating space, pooled their rations and cooked together. The communal cooking produced food that was, in most cases, not notably better than individually cooked food, but was better in the social sense that it produced a shared activity around a fire, which served purposes that went beyond nutrition. The mess fire was the place where the day's events were discussed, where the rumours that circulated through the army were evaluated and passed on or dismissed, where the men who had been in formation all day, unable to speak at normal volume, caught up with each other in the relaxed way of people who have completed the required thing for the day, and have a brief window before the required thing begins again. The rumours deserve attention because they were a primary information medium in an army that had no official internal communications beyond orders. The rumour told you things that orders did not tell you: where the army was going next, what had happened in the engagement 2 days ago, what the general had said to the regimental commander, whether the supply train was actually close behind the army, or was in the condition that the food situation suggested it might be. Rumours were unreliable in their specifics, and often accurate in their general direction, because they aggregated observations from the entire army, and the aggregated observations contained real information about the army situation, even when the specific claims were wrong. A rumour that the supply train had been captured was probably not literally true, but might accurately reflect the information that the supply situation was worse than officially acknowledged. The men who were hungry already knew the supply situation was worse than officially acknowledged. The rumour was not telling them something new. It was giving them language for something they already knew through their stomachs. The supply train, when it was present and functioning, was an enormous logistical enterprise that followed the army like a massive, slower, moving tail. Wagons carrying bread, flour, salt, powder, shot, replacement equipment, the personal baggage of the officers, the portable hospital supplies, the portable administrative apparatus of a campaign. The wagons required horses, and the horses required grain, and the grain had to come from somewhere, and somewhere increasingly meant the territory the army was moving through, which was a recursive problem. The army needed the countryside to feed the supply train that was supposed to feed the army. When the countryside ran out, the recursion collapsed. The women who accompanied the army are a category that official military history tends to minimize or romanticize, and that reality makes necessary to take seriously. Vivandières and cantinieres were women attached to regiments, officially authorized to sell food and drink to soldiers, who followed the army on campaign and provided a commercial food and drink supplement to the official rations. They were not the romantic companions of the popular imagination, or not, exclusively. They were small business operators, running mobile supply operations in one of the more logistically complex environments imaginable, managing inventory and pricing and customer relationships under conditions that would have challenged established commercial enterprises, and many of them were survivors of multiple campaigns who had developed operational skills that the army found genuinely useful. Which sounds like faint praise until you realize that the army, which did not readily acknowledge the practical competence of anyone outside its official structure, genuinely valued these women's logistical contributions and at the records of their activities. In the memoirs of officers and in the administrative documents that occasionally noted their presence show a level of professional effectiveness that the official accounts tend to understate. There were also the wives and families of soldiers who simply followed the army because the alternative was poverty and abandonment. The laundresses, the seamstresses, the camp followers in the most accurate sense, women and children who lived in the camp's margins and performed services and tried to survive in the way that people try to survive in the margins of large military operations. Their presence was tolerated when the army could afford to tolerate it, and managed aggressively when it could not, which in practice meant they were permitted on campaign in good conditions and turned away or abandoned in bad ones, with consequences for the individuals involved that the official records do not preserve. The children born in camp to soldiers and to the women who followed the army were a category that the Napoleonic military administration addressed with the category of enfant de troupe, the regiment's child, who was given an unofficial status and a uniform in miniature and was raised by the regiment as a collective responsibility. Some of these children became soldiers themselves, the military life being the only life they knew. Some were formally educated by the regimental chaplain or schoolmaster when such positions existed. Some simply grew up in the camp and inherited the skills of camp life without inheriting any of the civilian skills that life outside the camp required. The enfant de troupe was not a romantic figure, despite the paintings that sometimes depicted them with their small drums and their adult seriousness. The enfant de troupe was a child raised in an institution designed for adult men in conditions of violence and deprivation, which was a condition with specific effects on the development of a child that the institution was not designed to address and did not significantly attempt to. The regimental chaplain, where he existed, served a function that was neither purely religious nor purely medical, but occupied a space between the two that the official categories of the period did not fully account for. The men who were dying from disease or from wounds required, in addition to whatever medical intervention was available, some form of human attendance that was not purely procedural. The chaplain provided this, in whatever form his religious tradition prescribed, and in whatever additional forms the specific situation required. The memoirs of chaplains who served in the Napoleonic Wars describe the experience of attending the dying at a rate, and in conditions that produced its own specific kind of damage, the damage of witnessing accumulated death without adequate preparation or support, which was a condition that the theology they had been trained in addressed in principle, and the daily reality of a campaign's surgical tent, tested in ways that went beyond what principles could handle. The question of what the men believed religiously is one that the social history of the Napoleonic Wars has addressed carefully, because it is genuinely complicated. The French Revolutionary period had been aggressively secular, had closed churches, had attempted to replace religious practice with civic ceremonies, had created in the officer class and in the politically aware enlisted population a secular orientation that was genuine rather than performed. Napoleon himself had restored the Concordat with the Catholic Church in 1801 for reasons of state rather than conviction. The army contained men who were sincerely religious, men who were anti-clerical in the French revolutionary tradition, men who practiced religion as a cultural habit without deep personal conviction, and men who had arrived at the position common among soldiers who have spent time in combat. That formal theology was substantially less relevant to their actual situation than the immediate and practical question of whether the thing that was about to happen to them was going to hurt. The men who prayed before battles did not necessarily continue the relationship with the entity they were praying to after the battle, depending on the outcome. The men who survived a close call sometimes became more religious, and sometimes became less so, on the grounds that whatever was managing their situation had demonstrated an indifference to personal supplication that made supplication feel unproductive. The question of courage, which the official military culture addressed constantly and the private literature of soldiers addressed differently, is worth a few minutes. The official culture's model of courage was straightforward. Courage was the willingness to advance into danger without hesitation, to hold a position under fire, to perform the duties of a soldier in circumstances that made the performance of those duties likely to result in personal injury or death. Cowardice was the failure to do these things. The distinction was clean, and the punishment for public cowardice was severe, and sometimes immediate, in the sense that an officer had both the authority and in some circumstances the practical instrument at hand to enforce the distinction on the spot. The private model was more complicated. The soldiers who wrote about their own experience in letters and memoirs did not describe their battle experience primarily in terms of courage or cowardice. They described it in terms of what it was like: the noise, the smoke, the physical sensations of being in a formation under fire. The specific incidents that stayed in the memory, because they were unusual, or because they were the incidents in which particular friends became casualties, or because they were the moments when the situation became so extreme that the memory fixed on them with a clarity that ordinary experience does not produce. The emotion they described most often was not heroism, but something closer to a complex of fear and determination, and the specific kind of focused attention that occurs when the consequences of inattention are very clear, and the courage, when they described it at all, was not the absence of fear, but the management of fear in a context where management was required. Translation: the men who fought in these battles were afraid, and they fought anyway, because the situation required it, and the alternative was worse, and the management of that fear in that context was what the official culture called courage, and what the men themselves called getting through it. The management of fear over time, across multiple engagements and multiple campaigns, produced something that the veterans described as numbness, and that the psychological literature of later centuries would recognize as a form of emotional adaptation to chronic exposure to traumatic condition. The man who had been in 15 engagements was not braver than the man who had been in 3. He was differently adapted. His threshold for the triggering of acute fear responses had been adjusted by experience in ways that allowed him to function in situations that the new recruit could barely process. This was useful in the immediate tactical sense, and had costs in other senses that were not addressed by the official system, and were rarely addressed by the men themselves, who did not have language for what had happened to their emotional range, and who were operating in a social context that did not encourage the kind of introspection that would have identified the problem. The sleep deprivation that accompanied campaigning was a constant feature of the experience that has not received the analytical attention it deserves, possibly because it is not dramatic, in the way that battles and cold and starvation are dramatic. A man who has been sleeping 4 or 5 hours per night for 6 weeks, on the ground, in his uniform, with the noise of 40,000 men and their animals around him, is not operating at full cognitive capacity. He is making decisions about when to stop and when to continue, about whether to drink from this water source or find another, about how to manage his rations over the next 3 days, at a cognitive level that has been systematically degraded by the sleep deficit. The errors he makes in these decisions are errors that a rested man might not make, but the system that is producing the sleep deficit is the same system that is requiring the decisions, and there is no mechanism within the system for correcting the circularity. He makes the decisions he can make with the resources he has. Sometimes the decisions are adequate, sometimes they are not. The outcomes of the inadequate decisions are attributed to the situation rather than to the cognitive degradation that produced them, because the cognitive degradation was invisible and the situation was very visible. The question of what the men thought about during the march is addressed in the memoirs, in a way that is probably a partial record at best. The memoirs were written by literate men, which immediately skews the sample toward the better educated and often the better positioned. And they were written after the fact, which means they have been processed by memory in the ways that memory processes things. The unusual events are remembered more clearly than the ordinary ones. The moments of high emotion are more vivid than the long stretches of boredom. The retrospective meaning of events has been applied to the events themselves in ways that were not necessarily present at the time. What a man thought about during 8 hours of marching on day 43 of a campaign is not well preserved in any source, because no source found it interesting enough to record. The best guess, based on the available evidence, is that the thoughts were mundane in the way that the thoughts of very tired people in very uncomfortable situations tend to be mundane. Food, feet, the distance remaining. The man ahead of you who is maintaining exactly the pace that makes keeping up with him slightly more effortful than you would prefer. The letter you are composing in your head that you will write if you can find the materials and the time. The specific memory of a meal or a conversation or a particular physical comfort that the current situation makes very vivid by contrast. The heroic thoughts, the thoughts about glory and duty and the destiny of nations, may have been present at moments. They were probably not present continuously over 8 hours of marching on the same road you had been marching on for 6 days. The documentary evidence of the minds of the men in the column is thin, but the documentary evidence of their physical situation is extensive, and the physical situation does not support a model in which heroic abstraction was the primary mental content. There is one more thing worth understanding about the Napoleonic Wars that is present in everything described tonight, and rarely foregrounded: the sound. The Napoleonic battlefield was the loudest human environment that existed before the Industrial Age, and possibly the loudest human environment that has existed outside of the Industrial Age's own contributions to acoustic extremity. Artillery at close range produced a physical impact on the body beyond the hearing loss that it caused, a concussive effect that was felt in the chest and the stomach and the skull, a sensation that had no civilian equivalent, and for which the men had no prepared response. The sustained noise of a major battle, which could involve 200 or 300 artillery pieces firing continuously for several hours, plus the musket fire of tens of thousands of infantry, plus the drums, the trumpets, the shouts of command, and the non-command sounds of men in extremity, was so extreme that men who experienced it described it not as loud in the ordinary sense, but as a physical environment with its own properties, a noise, whether in which ordinary sensory processing ceased to function, and the body was operating on the reflexes and the training alone. The hearing damage was permanent and widespread. Veterans of multiple Napoleonic campaigns frequently had significant hearing loss by the end of the war, documented in the medical records and described in the memoirs as a fact of life rather than a complaint. The tinnitus that accompanied the hearing loss, the constant ringing that occupies the auditory field when the cochlea has been damaged, is mentioned by enough veterans that it can be treated as a common experience rather than an individual one. The men who came back from the wars heard the world differently than they had heard it when they left, in the literal sense that their auditory range had been reduced by exposure to conditions that the auditory system was not designed to survive intact. This too, they did not have language for, and did not treat as a medical condition, and absorbed into the general category of what the war had done to them. What the war had done to them is a category that contains many things, and the men who filled the category tended to do so privately, because the culture they returned to had limited capacity and limited interest in receiving a detailed accounting of the contents. The official culture celebrated the victory, and later, for the men who had fought on the losing side, managed the defeat. And both processes focused on the collective narrative, the army, the empire, the nation. The individual experience of the soldiers was neither the primary subject of the official narrative, nor the primary interest of the civilian population that received the soldiers back. The civilian population had its own 12 years to account for, its own accumulated losses and adjustments, and the specific experience of living in a country at continuous war, which was its own kind of experience, and not uncostly, but which was different from what the soldiers had undergone and not, in most cases, comprehensible across the difference. The difference was not simply that the soldiers had seen more violence. It was that the soldiers had been in a total environment that shaped everything about how they experienced the world for the duration of their service, how they understood time, how they assessed risk, what they considered normal in terms of physical discomfort and human vulnerability and the transience of individual lives. They had been in a world where the ordinary conditions of civilian life, stable shelter, predictable food, personal safety, were not available as background assumptions, but were things that occasionally occurred, and that you noted when they did, the way you note exceptional weather. The civilian world, which took these things for granted in the ordinary way of people who have always had them, was organized around assumptions that the soldiers no longer shared. And the gap between the assumptions was not something that could be bridged by explanation, because explanation required the listener to imaginatively inhabit a set of conditions that they had no experiential reference point for. Some veterans managed the gap better than others. Some found civilian life reassembled itself around them without too much difficulty, the old patterns returning faster than they had expected. The body's memory of how to live a life without military structure reasserting itself in the way that the body remembers skills that have not been practiced for a while. Others found the gap persistent, found that they were operating in the civilian world with a set of calibrations that had been adjusted to an environment that no longer existed, finding the ordinary pace of civilian life too slow, and too unserious, and too focused on small things, or alternatively finding it overwhelming in its openness. The absence of the structure that had defined every hour for 12 years producing not freedom, but a disorienting lack of the constraints that had also been, in some sense, a form of support. The physical damage was visible and permanent for a significant portion of the survivors. Men who had lost limbs at the surgeon's table, Men who walked with the gait of the badly healed fracture, because fractures in the field were set by whatever means were available, and healed in the configuration they were in when they healed. Men whose faces carried the specific marks of battlefield injuries, the powder burns, the healed scars of cuts and strikes, that had been dressed in the field with whatever was available, and had closed in ways that were functional, but not cosmetically careful. The visible damage was a documentation of service that was legible to anyone who looked, and the communities that received the veterans back could read it. And what they read was not always comfortable to read, and the discomfort was absorbed into the general practice of not looking directly at things that were uncomfortable to look at directly. The invisible damage was less legible and less consistently acknowledged, but it was there in the records, if you know what to look for. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars show up in the court records, and the medical records, and the social welfare records of the post-war period in patterns that are recognizable from later conflicts: elevated rates of alcohol dependence, elevated rates of interpersonal violence, patterns of social withdrawal, difficulty maintaining civilian employment, the specific sadness of men who have been defined by an experience that has ended and who are not sure what they are in the absence of it. The period did not have diagnostic categories for what we now call post-traumatic stress. It had the categories it had, which were moral and social rather than medical, and the men who were struggling were addressed through those categories, which meant they were primarily addressed as social problems rather than medical ones, which was not always, or even usually, the most helpful framing. Let us talk about what it meant to be wounded and to survive the wound, because surviving the wound was not the end of the story, and the story after the wound was one that the official records handled badly. You were shot, most likely in the arm or leg, because the geometry of a firing line meant that extremity wounds were more common than torso wounds, and you were moved, if you could be moved, to the regimental aid post, which was a position behind the fighting line staffed by the regimental surgeon and his assistants, and organised to perform the initial assessment and the basic interventions before the more serious cases were sent further back to the field hospital. The field hospital was a building, if a suitable building was available, or a tent if it was not, and it contained the operating table, which was not a table designed for surgery, but whatever flat surface was available and sufficiently stable, and the surgeon's instruments and the pile of lint that served as dressing materials, and the assistants who, held the patient down during procedures that required holding the patient down, which was most of the procedures because there was no general anaesthesia in 1812, and the closest available substitute was alcohol, administered in a quantity that reduced the patient's cognitive clarity without reliably eliminating the experience of pain. The speed of the surgery, which has already been mentioned in the context of amputation, had additional significance in the hospital setting. The more quickly the surgeon could complete a procedure, the more patients he could see in the time available, and time was always the constraining factor in a major engagement's medical aftermath. A large battle produced several thousand casualties that required surgical attention simultaneously, and the number of surgeons available to provide that attention was a fraction of what would be needed to address the population in any comfortable time frame. The triage decision, which the period handled pragmatically if not systematically, was the decision about which patients could benefit from immediate intervention, and which could not, and the practical implementation of this decision was shaped by factors that the medical ethics literature of later centuries would find uncomfortable: the rank of the patient, the likelihood of a quick return to service, the relationship between the patient and the senior officers, who were also present, and whose advocacy could affect the sequence of treatment. The men who lay on the battlefield waiting for collection were collected by the stretcher parties when the battle permitted, and when enough men were available to form stretcher parties, which was not always the case during the battle itself, and sometimes not the case in the immediate aftermath either. The Napoleonic Wars produced one significant innovation in battlefield medicine: the ambulance volante, the flying ambulance, developed by Dominique Jean-Larrey, Napoleon's chief surgeon, which was a horse-drawn vehicle designed to move rapidly to wounded men on the battlefield, rather than waiting for the wounded to be brought to the medical position. Larrey was a genuine innovator and a genuine humanitarian, and his reforms improved the speed and effectiveness of the French medical system relative to what had existed before, and the men who were reached by his ambulances sooner than they would otherwise have been reached were better off for the improvement. The improvement was real and insufficient. The demand for medical care in a major engagement exceeded the supply by a margin that reforms in collection speed could reduce, but not eliminate. The men who recovered from their wounds in the field hospital and were judged fit enough to be moved were moved to the base hospitals, which were established in towns and cities behind the army, and which were in the worst-case scenarios. The places where the epidemic diseases that shadowed the army were concentrated at their highest densities. The hospital of the Napoleonic period was not yet understood as a controlled environment in the sense that later medical practice would develop. The germ theory was not yet available. The connection between crowding wounded and ill men into enclosed spaces and the subsequent spread of disease among both the patients and the staff was understood empirically by observant surgeons, but not theoretically by the system. And the practical consequence was that the base hospital was simultaneously the place where the most serious cases went for care and the place where the most dangerous concentrations of pathogens were maintained. A man who survived his wound and was sent to the base hospital for recovery was in an environment with a significant probability of acquiring a second disease-based injury that was not connected to any enemy action. This happened at a rate high enough to be one of the better documented features of the Napoleonic medical system, and the system's response to the documentation was to attempt improvements that made incremental rather than fundamental differences, because the fundamental improvement required knowledge that did not yet exist. The question of what happened to men who were too badly wounded to return to service, but not so badly wounded as to die of their injuries, is one that the welfare literature of the period addresses with varying degrees of consistency. The H-Tel des Invalides in Paris, established in the 17th century for veteran soldiers, was one of the models that other nations emulated to varying degrees. But the scale of the Napoleonic Wars produced a veteran population with disabilities that the available institutions could not absorb. The men who were discharged on medical grounds with a pension were in a better position than the men who were discharged without one, and the difference between having and not having the pension was often the difference between a difficult return to civilian life and an extremely difficult one. The pension system was real and underfunded and administratively unreliable in ways that the men who depended on it experienced directly. Officially, they were entitled to support. Unofficially, the support materialized intermittently and in amounts that reflected the financial condition of the state, rather than the needs of the men it was supposed to support. The prisoners of war deserve more than they typically receive in accounts of this conflict. The Napoleonic Wars produced large numbers of prisoners on all sides, and the experience of captivity varied enormously depending on who had captured you, where you were held, what year of the war it was, and the relationship between your captor's government and your own at the moment of your capture. French prisoners held in Britain were held on prison ships. The hulks, which were decommissioned warships, moored in harbour and used as floating prisons, and which combined the discomforts of a ship at permanent anchor with the additional complications of being imprisoned, producing an environment that the surviving accounts describe with consistent unhappiness. The mortality rate on the hulks from disease was significant, and was documented by both the British Prison Administration and the French diplomatic protests. And neither documentation nor protest produced rapid improvement, because the improvement was not a priority of the party responsible for providing it. British prisoners in France were held in inland depots, most famously Verdun, where the conditions for officer prisoners were considerably more comfortable than the conditions for enlisted prisoners, reflecting the general principle that the resources devoted to a prisoner's comfort scaled with his rank and the associated ransomability, or exchange value. An officer prisoner at Verdun, if he had money or family resources, could rent private accommodation in the town, receive packages from home, maintain something approaching a social life within the constraints of parole, and wait out the war in conditions that were inconvenient rather than dangerous. An enlisted prisoner at a French depot had a different experience, one that the memoirs and official records describe in terms of hunger, cold, inadequate shelter, and mortality rates that were higher than the comfortable depots for officers and much higher than the popular imagination of prisoner of war experience in this period typically allows. The exchange of prisoners, which was the formal mechanism for returning men to their armies without requiring their escape or the end of the war, was conducted through a bureaucratic framework that reflected the diplomatic relationship between the belligerents and the relative value each side assigned to the men being exchanged. Exchanges happened and were genuinely important to the men whose return they produced. They also failed to happen on many occasions when they should have happened, and were delayed by administrative failures and diplomatic deteriorations that had no relationship to the condition of the men waiting for the exchange to occur. The man who had been promised an exchange and was waiting for it to materialize was in a specific kind of limbo that combined the discomforts of captivity with the additional frustration of knowing that release had been agreed in principle, and the gap between principle and practice was administrative rather than fundamental. Let us talk about Spain more specifically, because Spain had its own complete texture of misery, that was different enough from the Russian experience and the Central European experience to require its own discussion. The Peninsular War began in 1808 when Napoleon replaced the Spanish king with his own brother Joseph, and the Spanish population responded with an uprising that had the character of a national insurgency from its beginning. The Spanish army was not, in the early phases, the primary military problem. The primary military problem was the population, not organized as an army, not operating by the conventions of military engagement, not confined to any identifiable front or territory, and sustained by a hostility toward the French occupation that had the quality of something more fundamental than political opposition. You are in Spain in 1809. The army has been here for a year, and the year has not produced the pacification that was predicted in the original operational planning. The original operational planning assumed that the defeat of the Spanish regular army would produce the conditions for political accommodation, because that was how European wars worked in this period. You defeated the army, you negotiated with the government, the population accepted the outcome. Spain did not work this way. You defeated the regular army. The government collapsed. The population did not accept the outcome. The population picked up whatever weapons were available and continued the contest through methods that the formal military system had no adequate doctrine for addressing. The guerrilla, the word itself being Spanish and meaning little war, operated in the spaces between the French garrisons and along the supply routes that connected them. A French courier riding between two towns was a target. A small foraging party moving through the countryside was a target. A company detached to investigate a reported guerrilla concentration was potentially a target if the concentration turned out to be larger than reported, or if the terrain was as useful to the guerrillas as it often was. The French response oscillated between reprisals, which increased the hostility of the population without eliminating the guerrillas, and conciliation efforts, which were structurally incompatible with the military operations that were generating the grievances the conciliation was supposed to address. The climate of Spain added its own dimension to the military experience. The Central Plateau in summer was hot, in a way that Northern European soldiers were not prepared for, a dry heat that dehydrated men faster than the campaigning instinct allowed for, producing heat casualties on the march at rates that the medical system treated as an irritant, and that were in fact a significant operational factor. The winters in the mountains, particularly in the campaigns through the Pyrenees and across the Castilian Mamista, were cold with a different quality than the Northern European cold. Drier, clearer, the cold radiating from a sky that offered no cloud cover and no promise of moderation. The men who were equipped for French winters were not equipped for Spanish winters, which required different clothing for different reasons. And the supply system that might have provided the different clothing was the same supply system that was being regularly disrupted by the guerrillas, who made moving anything through Spain reliably difficult. The food in Spain was different from the food in France or Germany or Poland, and the difference was, in the context of a starving army, significant. Spanish agriculture in the early 19th century was organized around crops and livestock that reflected the Mediterranean climate and the particular practices of each region, and the French army's ability to extract food from this system was limited by its unfamiliarity with where things were stored, by the population's skill at concealing food from armies they wanted to leave, and by the physical difficulty of the terrain, which, in much of Spain, made the kind of systematic agricultural extraction that worked in northern France much less practical. The army in Spain was often hungry in a context where food existed but was not accessible, which is a specific kind of hunger that has its own frustration distinct from the straightforward absence of food. The British army in Spain, the army that Wellington commanded and that ultimately pushed the French out, was operating under its own set of severe conditions that are sometimes underemphasized because the British ended the campaign as victors, and victors' conditions tend to be retrospectively softened by the victory narrative. Wellington's army was short, supplied, badly supported by a government that managed the Peninsular Campaign as a secondary theatre and operating in the same difficult Spanish terrain that was challenging the French. Wellington himself was famously unromantic about the men under his command, describing them in terms that reflected both his genuine understanding of their qualities and his class, based assumptions about their origins. And the relationship between Wellington and his army was defined by a professionalism that was real on both sides, and a warmth that was real on the side of the men, and more complicated on the side of the general. His soldiers fought effectively under conditions that required a high level of endurance and unit cohesion, and they maintained their fighting capacity through the years of the Spanish campaign, because of qualities that Wellington's famous description of them as the scum of the earth entirely failed to capture. The Battle of Salamanca in 1812, which was one of the decisive engagements of the Peninsular War and one of Wellington's most admired tactical performances, was fought in July in high summer heat. The men on both sides who fought it had been marching in the Spanish summer for weeks. The French army under Marmont had approximately 50,000 men. The Allied army under Wellington had approximately 50,000 as well. The battle lasted approximately 40 minutes of decisive engagement, which is brief for an engagement of that scale, and produced approximately 15,000 total casualties between the two sides. The aftermath included the usual features of a major engagement's medical consequences, amplified by the heat, which accelerated the deterioration of the wounded in ways that the surgeons noted and could not address. The battle was a French defeat. The defeated army retreated. The victorious army advanced. The dead were buried. The wounded who could be moved were moved. The wounded who could not be moved were left to the care of the local population, which in Spain in 1812 was not a guaranteed form of care. The local population's relationship with the armies moving through their territory was one of the most complicated human dimensions of the Peninsular War, because the Spanish population contained the full range of human responses to an impossible situation: collaboration, resistance, flight, and the more common position of simply trying to survive the passage of armies through territory that had been organized for peaceful agriculture and was now organized by the armies and by the guerrillas and by the political disruption for something else entirely. The families who hid their grain did so not from political commitment in all cases, but from the practical calculation that the grain was what stood between their children and starvation, and that any army, French or British or Spanish regular or guerrilla, would take it if they found it. The families who aided the guerrillas did so in some cases from patriotic conviction, and in other cases because the guerrillas were their neighbours and armed, and the French were strangers and also armed, and the calculation of which group to risk offence which depended on which group was more present on any given day. The economics of a campaign were, for the soldiers participating in it, primarily relevant in the form of pay, which was theoretically a regular feature of military service, and practically an intermittent one. The French army was often in arrears on its pay during the later campaigns, when the financial strain of maintaining multiple simultaneous theatres was straining even the resourceful fiscal architecture of the Napoleonic state. A soldier who had not been paid in 3 months was a soldier who could not purchase anything from the cantinera or the local market, which removed one of the supplementary nutrition sources that the official ration was designed to be supplemented by, and which produced the specific frustration of being owed money by an institution you could not leave and could not effectively pressure for payment. The pay, when it arrived, was expressed in units that reflected where the army was and what the local monetary system was. An army operating in Germany paid in German coins, or in French coins at the exchange rates that the army's administration determined, which were not always the exchange rates that the local market determined. An army operating in Spain dealt with the Spanish monetary system, which had its own internal complications, and with the question of whether the coins in circulation were the official currency, or one of the imitations that war always generates. The soldier who was trying to buy a meal or a drink with the coins he had been paid needed to know whether the coins were acceptable to the seller, and at what rate, which was a financial calculation that fell well outside the training that the military depot had provided, and was learned through the experience of being refused or cheated often enough to develop the relevant instincts. The music of the campaign was not only the drums and the trumpets. The evening fire produced its own music, the informal music of men in the camp, with time they were not required to fill with anything specific. Soldiers sang. Not always, not every evening, not in any organised way, but consistently enough across the memoirs and the letters that it registers as a genuine feature of the experience, rather than a rare occurrence. The songs were the songs that men brought with them from their villages and their regions, folk songs, drinking songs, songs that were specific to a region or a dialect, and that carried in their melody and their words a compression of the place of origin that the march away from that place had made suddenly precious. A song from home, sung in the dark around a fire 200 kilometres from home, was a different kind of object than the same song sung in the village, and the men who sang it in the field were not performing home so much as briefly inhabiting it, which is a form of resilience that has nothing to do with military training and everything to do with the human capacity to maintain a self in conditions designed to reduce you to a function. The languages of the Grande Arme he produced their own music, of a different kind. An evening fire at which French soldiers, German soldiers, Polish lancers, and Dutch fusiliers were all present was an evening fire at which several languages were being spoken simultaneously, and the communication that crossed the language barriers did so through the universal media of gesture, shared physical context, and the specific vocabulary that develops rapidly between people who need to communicate and do not share a language. The Napoleonic camp had a lingua franca that was part French and part German and part gesture and part shared military terminology that translated across the national contingents because it referred to shared objects and shared experiences. This language was not documented systematically, but it surfaces in the memoirs often enough to confirm that it existed and that it served the function of maintaining a minimum of social connection across the linguistic diversity of the army. The relationship between French soldiers and the other nationalities in the Grande Armée was not uniformly warm, and the memoirs are honest enough about this to provide a record. The French were the numerically dominant group, and the language of command was French, and the institutional culture was French, and the men from other nations were participating in an army organised around an identity that was not theirs. The Polish contingent, which was large and which fought with a particular intensity, rooted in the Polish political calculation that Napoleon represented the best available option for Polish national restoration, had a distinct identity within the army, and a distinct relationship to the French that was simultaneously allied and separate. The Germans, of whom there were many and from many different German states, occupied a range of positions from the enthusiastically aligned to the pragmatically conscripted to the actively alienated, depending on their specific origin and the specific political circumstances of their nation's relationship with France. The Italians, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Spaniards who had been incorporated into the French imperial structure, each brought their own national context to a military institution that was formally supra-national and practically French, and the friction and the accommodation between these identities was a constant background feature of daily life in the army. By the time the wars ended, many of these men had been so thoroughly transformed by the military experience and so removed from their origins that the national identity they had brought with them had been modified by the experience in ways that neither they nor their nations of origin had anticipated. A Pole who had served 15 years in the French army, who had marched to Moscow and back, who had fought in Spain and Germany and Italy, who had learned French and learned the French military culture, and lived within it for the formative years of his adult life, was not the same Pole who had left his village in 1800. He was something that his village, if he returned to it, would recognise as a familiar type, the soldier back from the wars, and simultaneously as something new, someone whose experience had exceeded the frame within which his original identity had been formed, and had not yet found a new frame adequate to contain it. That was just the march to Moscow. Wait until you hear about the naval wars that ran parallel to all of this, where men were ganged into a world with its own specific miseries, trapped at sea for years at a time, in conditions that make the infantry situation look, in several specific respects, like a better option. But that is a story for another evening. There is a number that crystallizes what this entire period was about, and it is this. In the 12 years of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe lost somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million military personnel, and somewhere between 1 and 3 million civilians, depending on how you count and which sources you trust, and how you handle the statistical uncertainty around the Russian campaign, which was so large and so chaotic that the numbers are genuinely disputed. Call it 3 to 5 million dead from military causes alone. Add the demographic cost of those millions not having children they would otherwise have had. Add the maiming and the chronic illness and the lifelong disability. Add the economic disruption of a continent at continuous war for 12 years. The number becomes so large that it resists the imagination, which is one of the ways that very large numbers of deaths have always been managed by the people who survived them. The imagination performs a scale reduction that is not deliberate, but is functionally protective, converting the aggregate into the manageable. Tonight has tried to resist that scale reduction by staying with the individual. The man in the boots. The man eating the bread that was not quite bread. The man marching the 40th day of a campaign that began on a road from which the end could not be seen. These men were not abstractions. They were people in specific physical conditions, at specific moments, experiencing the things they experienced with the full weight of individual consciousness that all people bring to their experience. And the fact that their individual consciousness is not preserved in any source does not mean it was not there. It was there. It is always there, in every historical situation, in every person who passed through events that we now describe in aggregates and statistics and strategic analyses, the individual experience, fully present, fully felt, now invisible. The invisibility is not permanent or not entirely. The letters that survive, the memoirs that were written, the court records and the medical records and the pension applications and the parish registers that record the deaths of soldiers' children while their fathers were on campaign, all of these are windows. Imperfect and partial, and skewed toward the literate and the administratively visible into the experience of the men who were there. Reading them slowly enough and carefully enough produces something that is not the experience itself, but is its trace. The outline of what it was like, pressed into the documents by the people who were living it and who needed to communicate something about it, either to the people they had left behind or to the posterity they could not have known would be reading their words 2 centuries later. The man who wrote home from Spain in 1810 that he was well and hoped to see his family soon was making a claim that may or may not have been accurate about his physical condition, and was expressing a desire that may or may not have been fulfilled by the events of the following months. The letter survived because someone kept it. The reason it was kept was that the person who received it valued it, which means the person who received it valued the person who sent it, which means the man in Spain in 1810 was part of a network of human relationships that extended back to the village, and that persisted across the campaign in the form of these communications, however infrequent and however incomplete. He was not alone in the way that the aggregate statistic of his campaign suggests. He was connected, thinly and across a long distance, to people who were waiting for him. Whether he came back is a question that the documents sometimes answer and sometimes do not. If he came back, the reunion was private and unrecorded in most cases, absorbed into the ordinary texture of village life. The traveller returned, the family reconstituted, as well as the absences allowed. If he did not come back, the absence was also private, also unrecorded except in the parish register and in the memory of the people who had been waiting, processed in the specific way that private losses are processed, without public ceremony or institutional acknowledgement, simply endured and integrated into the continuing life of the people it happened to. The pension records are perhaps the most honest single window into the aftermath, because they preserve in bureaucratic language the specific physical condition of specific men who had been in specific places and done specific things, and were now applying for compensation for the specific ways those things had damaged them. A man who applied for a pension in 1816, describing the loss of 3 fingers of his right hand from frostbite during the retreat from Moscow, was a real man with a real name in a real village, in a real department of France. And his application is a document that collapses the abstract catastrophe of the Russian campaign into the particular and the physical. These 3 fingers, this hand, this man, this village, this form, this clerk who received it and made a notation in the margin. The pension may have been granted, or it may have been denied. The fingers were gone either way. There is also something worth saying about the men who were not French, who fought in the armies that opposed Napoleon, and who have an equally full claim on the history of this period that the French-centered narrative of the Napoleonic Wars often underemphasizes. The Russian soldier who stood in the winter of 1812 watching the Grande Arme, he retreat along a road that the Russian army had been defending for months, was a man with his own set of physical conditions, his own hunger and cold and exhaustion, his own relationship to the violence he had been in and the violence still to come. The British soldier who survived Waterloo and walked back across the battlefield on the evening of the 18th of June, 1815, was a man with his own complete human situation, not reducible to his role in the Allied victory. The Prussian soldier who arrived at Waterloo in the late afternoon, and whose timely appearance is given credit in the British military tradition for saving the Allied cause, was a man who had been marching hard since before dawn in the rain, and who was not in the narrative position of saviour that the subsequent history assigned him, but was simply a man at the end of a very long and violent day. All of these men, on all sides, were in the same war in the sense that the war was the context they shared, and in different wars in the sense that the war's texture was different in Russia than in France, different in Britain than in Poland, different for the man in the line than for the man on the horse. The Napoleonic Wars were not one experience. They were millions of experiences that occurred in proximity to each other, and that shared the structural features of military campaigns: the march, the hunger, the cold, the battle, the wound, the long wait for something to end. The shared structure does not make the experiences identical, but it makes them recognizable to each other across the divisions of nationality and rank and historical position that otherwise separate them. The man in the French line and the man in the Russian line were, before they were enemies, both men who had been assigned to a position in a conflict they had not designed and were not directing, who were cold when it was cold and hungry, when the supply ran out, and afraid when the noise of the battle made the situation clear, and who managed these conditions with whatever resources they had. The camaraderie, the habit of endurance, the specific human capacity for making the unbearable bearable by simply continuing to bear it. This is not a pacifist argument, and is not meant as one. It is an observation about the texture of human experience under extreme conditions, which tends, when examined closely, to produce more similarity than the political and strategic frameworks within which it occurs would suggest. Before the wars ended, there was one final thing the men in this story had to manage, which was the knowledge that the wars were ending. Not immediately, not with the clean clarity of a date on a calendar, but gradually, through the accumulation of evidence that the strategic situation had reached a point from which no further campaign could reasonably recover. The retreat from Moscow had been a catastrophe, but Napoleon had rebuilt an army in 1813 and fought the German campaign, and then lost Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, where the coalition armies finally concentrated against him, in numbers sufficient to decide the question. And then he had abdicated briefly in 1814. And the men who had survived to that point had been through the experience of ending a war, which was its own specific kind of experience, and not the simple relief that the word ending implies. Ending a war, for the men in the line, meant the cessation of the daily conditions they had been managing for, however many years they had been in service, which included the terrible conditions, but also the structure, the belonging, the clarity of purpose, and the specific social world that military service created. The man who had been a soldier for 10 years was about to stop being a soldier, and the thing he was about to become, a civilian, was something he had a childhood memory of but no adult experience of, and the transition was not supported by any institutional preparation. You were in the army until you were not. Then you were not. The gap between those two states was bridged by whatever internal resources you had accumulated, and by whatever external support your family and community could provide, and the adequacy of those resources varied as widely as the men who needed them. Napoleon returned in 1815, the 100 Days, the news travelling through France, and through the veteran population, like something electrical, and the men who went back were making a choice that tells you something important about what military service had meant to them. Not all veterans returned. Many had settled back into civilian life and did not go back, had made their calculation and arrived at the conclusion that whatever the outcome of the campaign, it was not their outcome to participate in. But a significant number did go back, and the question of why is answered differently by different historians, but includes, as one consistent thread, the simple fact that the military world was the world they knew best, and Napoleon's return offered the possibility of return to that world, which for some men was more appealing than the civilian world they had been struggling to re-enter. Which sounds X until you realise why. It sounds like loyalty to Napoleon. It was, in many cases, loyalty to the life. The wars ended. The men who survived them lived their lives, shorter on average than they would have been without the wars, differently shaped by what they had been through, carrying the experience in ways that were both visible and invisible. Some of them told their stories. Most of them did not, or told only portions, or told them only to the people who shared them, the other survivors, the other veterans, the tent mates, and the messmates, and the men who had been in the same line on the same day, and who therefore already knew the important parts, and did not require the telling. The untold stories are not lost in the sense of being gone. They are present in the bodies that carried them, and in the communities that received those bodies back, and in the documents that the bodies generated in their passage through the administrative systems of the period. They are recoverable in outline, if not in full. Tonight has been an attempt at the outlines. For now, the campaign is over. The fire that you built in the field every evening that you were allowed to build a fire is out. Your tent mate has gone back to his village, wherever that is, the same direction as you, or a different one. The same language as yours, or not quite. The boots that were never the right size have finally, through the irreversible process of being worn for 3 years in all weathers, become the right size, which is the kind of victory that is available when larger victories are not. The road behind you stretches east for 900 kilometers, and then keeps going. You have walked most of it, and you are not going to walk it again. Dim the lights. Sleep. Well, tomorrow? The road is quiet.